I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. It's fall book season, and let me tell you, business is a-boomin'. I read the new Stephen King book, Szalai. We had him on last week's episode. Check that out if you haven't. I've read the new Zadie Smith book, and it looks like hopefully we'll have her on an upcoming episode. And I read big chunks of this very large new biography of Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson. We are not going to have Elon Musk on a future episode. Joining me today is Jennifer Szalai, our nonfiction book critic, to talk about that Musk biography. We're also going to talk about a recent profile that Jen wrote for the New York Times Magazine about the activist and author Naomi Klein, whose new book is titled Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World. Jen, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Gilbert.
So this is an almost 700-page biography, and you received your copy less than a week ago at the time that we're recording. So before we dig into the book itself, I just want you to give our listeners a little taste of what it's like to read, digest, and write about a book like this on such a tight deadline.
It's quite the experience. It doesn't happen all the time that the deadline is quite this tight for a book that's this big, involving a figure who it turns out is this controversial. But in any case, with this book, there was just a lot of reading, a lot of note-taking, a lot of using these little sticky flags in the book to highlight parts that I wanted to come back to later.
I see your copy here across the table. It is a rainbow of little Post-it notes.
It is. I'm not sure, to be honest. I feel like at this point with the Post-it notes, there are so many in this book that it's more just for my own process while I'm doing it rather than to go back to later, just because looking at it right now, I'm not sure how I could actually just find anything based on one particular note. But yeah, so there's a lot of sort of, there's an intense period of reading, absorbing, learning, also, researching. For example, there was a big biography of Elon Musk that was first published in 2015 by Ashley Vance. But that was in a different era of Elon Musk's activities. There's some background research, too, that needs to be done while working on a review like this.
Now, Jen, I think many of us at this point know who Elon Musk is. He's the richest person in the world. He's the CEO of the electric car company Tesla. He's the CEO of the space and satellite company SpaceX. He is now the owner of the social media company X, which is formerly known as Twitter. But this is a book that is also written by someone who, at least to book people, is fairly notable. That's Walter Isaacson. He is well known for his biographies of, quote, great men. I don't know if he would position this book in that lineage, but tell us a little bit, if you can, about Isaacson and why this was always going to be one of the sort of bigger nonfiction books of the fall.
Isaacson has written biographies of Leonardo da Vinci, of Henry Kissinger, of Steve Jobs. And I guess the Steve Jobs one is a book that many listeners might be familiar with already. And it's actually a book that Isaacson understandably refers to at several points in this Musk biography, because Jobs, of course, could be known as a prickly, demanding boss who was extremely ambitious when it came to what Apple could do, not just for technology, but for the world. And so, in a figure like Musk, we also have somebody who is known to be a prickly, obsessive, demanding boss who wants to change the world. But in this case, it's not just the world, but multi-planetary civilization, which is one of the terms that Musk uses at a certain point.
We are going to talk about Musk a bunch in a bit, but I just want to stay on Isaacson for a moment, because he is the type of, he used to be editor of Time Magazine, CEO of CNN, an old school journalist who writes biographies in a certain way. And this definitely does come in the direct lineage of Steve Jobs. The cover photograph of the Elon Musk book is essentially the same angle, the same front-on angle with a black background instead of a white background as the Steve Jobs book. So clearly he and his publishers, at least, are presenting this as the next in a series of biographies about the great modern innovators. Did you read the Steve Jobs book? Do you remember?
I did a while ago. That was a book, I think it was also interesting because some people read it as almost hagiographic of Jobs, but then the people who were close to Jobs, I think, were quite upset that it actually did get into the really difficult parts of his life and his personality.
So let's talk about the portrait of Musk that Isaacson presents here. He is a genius. He is a, quote, man-child with a giant ego, giant ambitions. He's moody. He's not great around people, but yet he has accomplished all these things, these amazing things, these amazing, impressive things. Hard to predict. What is the portrait that is presented in this book?
I think to a certain extent, Gilbert, those things are exactly it. I think one of the big questions that Isaacson tries to reconcile, which to me is actually maybe the less interesting question, but is just whether these things are connected, whether you can have somebody who wants to take people to the moon and also be a totally laid back, nice boss. And I think the implications that you get from the book and that Isaacson comes to at the end is that you can't really disentangle these things in his personality, that they're really tied together and tied up together. I think the thing that really complicates things in this book is Musk's acquisition of Twitter, because that is a platform where people have become privy to Musk's thoughts at various times of the day and night and, you know, these unedited thoughts that he'll put out into the world. And he's certainly become, I think, a way more controversial figure than he was in, say, 2015 when Vance had published his biography.
Jen, in your review, you write, Isaacson is a patient chronicler of obsession. In the case of Musk, he can occasionally seem too patient, a hazard for any biographer who is given extraordinary access. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
There's a few parts, and I name one in the review. The wording is so convoluted in terms of what Musk actually says that I'm not going to repeat it here because it's not in front of me. But there are just some things that Musk says to Isaacson where I just would have liked Isaacson to push him more. But I don't think that Isaacson saw that as part of what he necessarily wanted to do with this book. There will be plenty of evidence for people who don't like him and plenty of evidence for people who do like him, which I think is how Isaacson viewed his own job. But I think for somebody as enormously powerful as Musk is, with Starlink, with Twitter, with all of his billions, that I think there is a question of, okay, what is the larger context here beyond the sort of great man theory of who this person is? What is his impact on the world beyond the impact that he says that he's having, which is, I'm going to help people get to Mars?
Does it feel like he pulled his punches?
I wondered about Isaacson himself, like whether he had the punches, whether reflexively he himself was wondering about some things. There are a few places where he notes, especially when he can see how tough Musk can be toward his staff, where Isaacson is clearly taken aback, I think, in those instances. But at the same time, that is also neatly folded into this idea of somebody who just is really intense and really mission-driven. And I think Isaacson is troubled, I think, by some of the things that he's seen on Twitter and how they've been handled. And Twitter at this point, what Musk did after he bought it is he eliminated 75% of the staff. That's a huge cut. What Isaacson ends up saying at the end is the place is still functioning. A lot of people said that it would just totally collapse, but the place is still existing and people are still on it.
I remember many a night in which particularly people on media Twitter would be like, this is it. This is the night where, you know, Twitter falls apart. And I'm still there. I don't tweet very much, but I'm still there.
Well, and I think that that's sort of the bigger question, right? Will people's habits change? Because I think, and Isaacson makes, I think, a very good point toward the end about Twitter, which is Musk seems to have thought that he could run it as a technology company when, in fact, maybe it's better considered an advertising medium that really relies on social relationships. And in that sense, the implications of cutting the staff so severely and changing the name to X, changing the aesthetic, changing the dynamic, changing the way that things are moderated, those might have effects that are more palpable further down the line.
Surprisingly to me, Jen, one of the pieces of news that came out of your review was the fact that Elon Musk and his former partner Grimes, musician, they have several kids. Apparently they had a secret third child. Is this? I did a lot of work this weekend, like counting up children, and it was on many sites this weekend. It was a thing. They were all linking to your review because you talked about Isaacson's reveal of the fact that there's another child named Technomechanicus Musk.
Technomechanicus Musk. The nickname is Tau, according to the book.
And Musk went on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, which is what we call every time, to say, actually, no, the name is Tau Technomechanicus Musk. So it's not a nickname. It's the child's first name. Was that the most research-intensive part of your review?
It was actually interesting because in the book, Isaacson does say that Grimes and Musk had kept the existence, he uses the word existence, of this baby secret. And so I tried to look and I couldn't find any information about this child. I mean, the way that I think I phrased it in the review is very similar to the way that Isaacson mentions it, because I wasn't entirely sure, because obviously in a review like this, you're not going to call up Elon Musk to confirm.
You could have tweeted at him. He very well could have.
Although, as a critic, you're not supposed to.
Yeah, that's right. I would never urge you to break policy here.
I'm bound by certain rules.
Yeah.
So in any case, yes, apparently the existence of this child was not known by the public until the review. And it's mentioned, I mentioned in a parenthetical. It was just an aside.
Are the personal parts of Elon Musk's life as compellingly told as all of the work and professional trauma?
He is an intense person. So to a certain extent, a lot of the stuff was known before because he's been around for a while and he's been written about a lot. But yeah, the domestic intrigue is interesting. It's intriguing. And there's a lot that has happened in his personal life. He seems to not be able to deal with not a lot happening in his personal or professional life. I think that's the other thing that comes through. And there is this one sort of very poignant moment in the book where I think Isaacson is sitting with Musk and his children are playing around him and it's a beautiful day. And Musk is talking about a possible artificial intelligence apocalypse. It's like he can't really just sit back and enjoy nice things that are happening. Like he seems to thrive on, I think as Isaacson puts it, he thrives on dire threats.
It seems exhausting. It seems exhausting. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Book Review Podcast. I'm here with critic Jen Szalai. We've been talking about Elon Musk, the new biography by Walter Isaacson. Now we're going to pivot to a profile that Jen recently wrote in the New York Times Magazine about the author and activist Naomi Klein. It is on the occasion of her 9th book, which is titled Doppelganger, and it's a wild conceit. Jen, what is this book about?
I think to describe it, I should just describe the premise, but then the book actually grows into something else. The premise is Naomi Klein describes how over the past decade or so, she has frequently been confused with Naomi Wolf, who is the feminist intellectual who famously published The Beauty Myth in the early 1990s And since then, she herself has written a number of books that have looked at the way that power works. And most recently, during the COVID pandemic, Naomi Wolf has started talking a lot about conspiracy theories about vaccination and the pandemic. And so this is something that Naomi Klein wanted to write about because she herself has written a lot about the way that elites use power to their own advantage, but she sees how her own theories about power, which are coming from a very radical left-wing perspective, have gotten twisted, not just by people like Naomi Wolf, but by other people who in the past might have been considered liberal or left of center, to the point where they get invited, as Naomi Wolf has been invited, to appear on Tucker Carlson's show, on Steve Bannon's podcast. And so that's the launching off point for this book.
And Naomi Klein, just for those listeners who may not recall, author has been around for several decades. She's probably most famous for her first book, which came out in 1999, No Logo. She's also very well known for a book titled The Shock Doctrine. You write in your profile about the subtitle of this book, which is called A Journey into the Mirror World. And as you write, the mirror world, quote, is a realm both familiar and strange, where the anti-establishment critiques of the far left become co-opted by the far right, and where what once seemed like a yawning gulf between ostensible opposites has narrowed into a tenuous line. Talk to me a little bit about the ways in which she sees this mirror world showing itself across America.
She is actually now based in British Columbia. She's originally from Canada. She was born in Montreal, but she was born to parents who are from the States. She's lived in the States for a while. So she's interested a lot in what happens here in the United States. But she sees something happening in her own community in British Columbia, which I think we've seen all across the U.S. as well. We've seen in other parts of the world where there's this new movement, she calls it, like a new kind of social movement, a new political formation of people who are really into things that we often associate with like the hippy-dippy left of organic stuff, yoga, wellness, etc. But then when it came down to the pandemic, have turned out to be extremely anti-vaccine, against lockdowns, et cetera, et cetera. And so she saw this happening in her own community where people who she thought essentially would politically have views that are aligned with hers turn out to have views that align more with Steve Bannon's. And so that was something that she was very curious about. And that's what her journey into the mirror world describes.
As you also write in your profile, and I want to ask about writing a profile as a critic, but as you write, Klein had spent a lifetime analyzing the dominant power as oligarchic, relentless, resolute, delivered from on high. She was used to connecting dots, to mapping out cause and effect in the capitalist system, but it was becoming increasingly hard for her to map out what she was seeing, let alone plot it on the old left-right axis. Now, she is a writer who I think historically is more associated with one side of that axis, but she has always been a writer and a thinker that is a little heterodox, is interested in pushing back against dominant narratives. When you met up with her, did you find that the way that she presented as a person was the way that she has presented as a writer, as you've been reading her for these many decades?
In terms of her politics and her activism, she is adamantly a woman of the left. That is where her political commitments are. And I think her books are really interesting. First of all, I think because her politics are so radical, that is understandably what she is identified with, and I don't think she would object to that. She's very politically active and involved. But her books themselves are generally they're very well researched. Even if you don't agree with her conclusions, she really tries to present evidence in order to convince you, essentially, and persuade you that radical politics are the way to go. And she's also actually quite a funny person, which I think is something that people who don't necessarily read her books, they wouldn't necessarily be aware of because they just have this idea of who she is as an activist. And so that was an interesting experience. I think that when you meet her, you will get a sense of the voice that you see in her books. And this new book in particular is very personal. And so a lot of herself and her voice and her way of looking at the world does come through. And it did jibe with what I found when I met her.
I've always been a fan of when critics write profiles. When I was over on the Culture Desk, I used to love when Ben Brantley would write a big profile of a major Broadway star. John Caramonica regularly writes profiles of pop stars. What are the different ways in which you have to balance your repertorial, observational skills with your inherent voice as a critic when you're putting a piece like this together?
It is different in the sense that when I write reviews, I don't meet with the person. I can't meet with the person. I can't know the person who's written the book. And so you're just dealing with the finished work itself, the sort of artifact. Whereas when you're writing a profile, I think part of what you come to it as a critic is you do have that critical perspective on the work. And I think that needs to be in the piece. But I think also on top of that, you're dealing with the person and trying to figure out how they arrived at creating the work that they did. And so even if, in the case of this Naomi Klein profile, I make very clear what my opinion is of the book and my response to the book, but at the same time, I wanted to know why she ended up writing this book and how it came to be the book that it is. So spending time with a person, getting to know them, also talking to the people who know that person very well, it can really help flesh out the context in a way, which is really an interesting experience, I think, as a critic to look at that sort of larger contextual background.
Jen, we've talked about two authors in two books. I want to end this conversation by asking you, in probably much shorter time than the book deserves, to be honest, to talk about one final book that you reviewed so positively recently, which was a book called The Rigor of Angels. Great title.
Great title.
Evocative.
Yes.
What is it about?
So that's actually not an easy question to answer.
Oh, no. A fatal error here.
I'll just tell you this. So it's called The Rigor of Angels by William Egginton, and it's about the ultimate nature of reality. Is that enough?
Yeah, that's it. We're good. End of podcast. Who is it? It's about three thinkers. Free
figures. Borges, the Argentine fiction writer Borges, also the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and the German physicist Heisenberg. And so it's all about the way that we look at the world around us, the way that we understand reality, and how that's inevitably shaped by our perspective and how we understand it. And so it's fascinating. It includes philosophy, it includes quantum physics, it includes...
It's a big summer for quantum physics.
Exactly.
Are there parallels here to the Naomi Klein book?
Actually, it was so interesting because when I was working on the review of this book, I was finishing up the Klein profile. And Klein's book, a lot of it, because it's looking at conspiracy theorizing, the way that people understand reality, the way that people make things up, essentially, or misunderstand reality. So there were some overlaps, which I thought was really generative and fascinating.
And you would recommend that our listeners check out The Rigor of Angels?
Yes, I definitely recommend it, as well as Doppelganger.
You did not mention Elon Musk there, so I feel like you're sub-Xing the Elon Musk book right now. Jen, thank you so much, as always, for coming on the Book Review Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was my conversation with Jen Szalai, our nonfiction book critic, about Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson, Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World by Naomi Klein, and The Rigor of Angels by William Egginton. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.